There was a question on the forum about how to display text from a REST API call with an assigned delay in seconds for each string of text. So I created a quick example and then I'll show you how it was built. I'm going to go ahead and tap to start, and you'll notice up at the top there is an ID, a delay in seconds, and the text to be shown, the final one being 6 seconds. And then it'll finish itself up with a toast showing that says done. So that's what this does. Any amount of text that you pass back from the API and any delay you specify for each text will get displayed until it's at the end of the list. So this is the building of that text display and delay. Let's go ahead and look at the screen here just so you recognize what we were seeing before. Here's the ID, the delay, and the description. We're going to be using the unique ID to find each of the elements. The assumption is that the ID is sequential, increasing by 1 each time. The delay can be anything as long as it's numeric, and the text can be anything. I'm going to go ahead, and then this was the tap to start. And when we tap that, there's a whole set of logic I'll go through as well. Before I go into the logic though, let's take a quick look at the page variables. I've got 2 main variables. I have one hard-coded text list that contains the ID, the text to display, and the delay in seconds. The only thing that is a text value is the description. Both the others are numbers. If we look at the text list, it is a list of objects. And then I've just hard-coded 3 values. That's what you saw on the test that I just showed you on the other screen. This could be data coming back from a REST API just as easily, but you can see that the IDs increase by 1. If you were to have a gap, there would be probably an end actually to the display before it got to the ones after the gap. That's what the data looks like. That's what the text list looks like. And then there is an object, not a list, but just an object that contains the delay, the description, and the ID. The thing that's important here based on how I wrote it, you could choose to do it differently, but the way I wrote it is assuming that the properties in each of these variables match on name. And I'll show you why when we do the find to get each of the sequential elements. But delay description ID, it's important that they match exactly for the way that I've done it. Okay, so those are the variables that we're using. The page load, the page mounted, this is me initializing the display variable. The display variable is what's going to be bound to both the row, the cells in the row, as well as this text field here. And so I've picked the variable name, the page variable of display that we just looked at. And then we can look at the custom object. Once again, delay, description ID. And I'm just setting them to some initial values that you saw in the initial demo. So that sets it up when the page loads. And then for me, I did a tap to start. You could choose to initiate this in any way you wanted. Off of the component tap, the first thing that we're going to do is do a find formula to populate the full display object at once. And because we're finding the item, I'll bring this up, finding the item from the text list, which is what was representing the REST API call, and then searching within that text list for an ID that's equivalent to the current display ID. And if you remember, I initialized that initial display ID to 1. And so we are going to find the first element in the text list that has the ID of 1. And that means if it's found, it returns the whole object. And you can see examples here of what it would return. And by returning the whole object, I can set all 3 properties of the display variable at once. Your other option would be to have 3 set page variable flow functions and set each of the properties independently. If you did do it that way with 3 set page variables, then you would not have to worry about having the property names between text list and display be the same. Okay, so this set page variable here is what gets the data to initially display on the screen. And the reason for that is in the text field here, I am showing display.description. And then in each of these cells, you'll see I've got display.id, display.delay, and display.description. So these are the bindings that I'm using, and everything is bound to the display variable. And the text list is what's used to loop. So really what I have here in the logic off of this big header text in the middle of the screen is pulling the data out of the list and putting it into the display variable, then checking to see here, there we go, checking to see on that if the display variable that I've initialized is not empty. So if it's not empty, if that's a true condition, that means I have data, and I'm going to bind the display delay to a delay function. So it'll wait however many seconds you told it to. And then after it's delayed for that period of time, which means the text is shown on the screen for that time, then I'll come down to the set page variable, and I'm going to increment by 1 the page variable display ID. So the display page variable, its ID, I'm going to increment that by 1. And I wrapped it in a number because I was getting it to concatenate. So instead of 1 plus 1, it just made it a text field of 1, 1. So the number for me was important. I didn't really look into it further. There may be a simpler way to get that to be a plus all the time. So it goes from 1 to 2. So right here, I'm setting it to 2, and then I'm taking it right back up to the beginning of the loop, and I'm doing the find again. And now I'm going to be looking for the next text list item that has an item ID of 2, and then repeat the process. Now, the only way you break out of this loop is once this increments to 4, in my case, because I only have 3 items in the list. Once this is 4, I'm going to do a find. I won't find anything. The is empty will fail. Well, the not is empty will fail, and it'll show the done toast message and won't loop anymore. So I think that shows everything you need to know. If you're looking to have text on a screen or images or any controls for that matter, kind of show up in a slideshow timed